Welcome to the next installment in our rock mix tutorial. Hopefully you caught our first video covering miking of the drums, and from there we're going to move on to drum mixing. Before we start, let's once again orient ourselves with the finished track. I also want to solo the drums and give you a little A/B of the drums with and without processing so you can hear the difference and exactly what we're doing. So let's start with the kick drum. You'll notice this debleeder plugin that appears first in the chain, though it's not active. I'm going to talk about this a bit more in depth when we get to the toms, and it's also something that I don't use on my kick track very often, so I'm going to put that on hold and come back to it in a bit. That said, the first thing in the chain is our EQ. Generally speaking, you always want your EQ in front of your compressor in your signal chain, and that's true by and large for all of your tracks, so that your compressor is able to smooth any spikes that occur across the frequency spectrum that might be amplified by moves you've made in your EQ. The first thing I do is use my EQ plugin as a sort of magnifying glass to sweep the frequency spectrum of the track and find frequencies that are most undesirable, either contributing to mud or clutter or are interfering with frequency ranges that will be occupied by other tracks in the arrangement, etc. It's a pretty simple but very helpful trick. Pick one of your EQ bands, doesn't matter which one, draw a very narrow Q and boost the gain pretty high up. Then we're just going to play the track soloed and sweep across the spectrum and listen for areas we want to cut. This is a very useful technique and something I do on just about every track in a mix. Now you'll notice with the gain boosted very high and a narrow Q like this, a lot of different areas in the spectrum are going to sound odd or sound not right. That doesn't necessarily mean we want to cut all of those. The more you do this, you'll start to develop a sense of what to listen for, and you'll understand for each instrument in each track which frequencies actually do present a legitimate problem that you want to address. On the kick drum here, I'm finding some content in the range roughly between 75 and 160 hertz that I don't like. This range is a common offender in the kick drum. It is often the area where the boxy feeling comes from. You'll often hear mention of a kick drum having a tennis ball or a beach ball kind of sound, which is not uncommon when you're close miking, especially inside a kick drum. This area is where those problem frequencies tend to live and can usually do with a little cleaning up. Other than that, all I'm doing on this track is getting rid of some of the excess low frequency content with a high pass filter, adding a little extra low end around 55 hertz and adding a bit of definition to the attack with a slight shelf at 10K. The compression strategy on my kick is one that I use pretty regularly on both kick and toms, though I actually didn't do it on the toms on this track, but that's rare. The kick drum is a track that usually requires a pretty heavy hand when it comes to compression, but trying to achieve your end result with a single compressor can often sound unnatural and result in either a pumping effect or an undesirable sound when too much of your transient is squashed too quickly. Because your kick drum is the type of track that often has a great disparity between the levels of the various transients throughout the performance, a single compressor won't necessarily treat them all properly. A common approach is to use multiple compressors in order to achieve the desired result without overworking any one compressor. The first compressor has a threshold set pretty high relative to the input gain, so we're only getting a few dB of compression on average. Our attack and release time are also set to let enough of the attack through to still sound natural and not choke the drum, but fast enough release time to allow the tail or the decay to come back up into the mix. And as you can see, our ratio is not too heavy here. It's about 3.4 to 1. Now, because of the makeup gain we're adding to the signal coming out of the first compressor, the input level on the second compressor is naturally higher. So our threshold on the second compressor is also higher to sort of be in line with the input signal it's receiving. The job of the first compressor is really to do most of the taming transients and spikes. The second compressor is then coming into play when the signal, already attenuated by the first compressor, surpasses the second threshold as well. The effect of the compression is much more natural in this application as opposed to applying a single compressor with a threshold of around minus 28 dB and a ratio of 8 to 1 or more. Because our compressor is working in stages, the amount and type of compression being applied to each hit is more customized to each instance rather than just a heavy press down across the entire track. At the end of the chain, I've got a transient shaper to help bring some more of the decay of the shell back into the picture after the compression. Moving on to our snare drum, right out of the bat, you'll see that I'm breaking one of my rules from earlier, but that's okay, and I'll show you why. If we throw the EQ in front of the compressor, you'll notice that the snare drum has now lost some of its edge, some of its sharpness, or at least I think so. This was a case where I started out with a general rule, but made adjustments based on what I heard in the mix. That aside, you're going to see a very similar approach here as we saw in the kick drum. Layered compressors followed by a transient shaper to help restore some of the sustain. Similar staging and strategy with the layers of each compressor, except that with the snare drum, I'm doing a little more attenuation with the first compressor and a little less with the second. Here is my snare drum EQ profile. While there are some general guidelines that you can follow to help EQ a snare drum, and a lot of sort of snare drum EQ information can be found online, I'm not going to go too into detail on that here. A lot of what you do to your snare drum is going to vary from session to session, depending on the drum you're using, the tuning of the drum, the sound and the liveliness of the room that you're in, and to a large degree, the preference of the artist and how they want the snare drum to sound in the mix. For example, I often end up carving a little notch out of the snare drum around 160, 180 hertz, much like we did with the kick drum. Generally, that gets rid of some of the muddiness and helps give a little clarity to it. In this particular song, it didn't sound right to me when I did that, so I ended up leaving it sort of neutral, if you will, and I'll A-B that for you so you can see what I mean. So hopefully you're starting to notice a trend here. Guidelines and rules for mixing are helpful as a starting point, but you've always got to listen to what's happening in your session and respond to it and give the song what it needs. Guidelines are excellent as a starting point, but understanding the reasoning behind it will put you in a position to recognize when to ignore the guidelines. Last on the snare drum is Slate Revival. Slate describes this plugin as a quote-unquote sonic enhancer, imparting harmonic content and distortion, often attributed with analog, tape, transformer-based hardware and equipment that's not very often used in the digital realm. This is actually a free plugin, though it requires an iLok to use. And it's just a really nice plugin to help add sheen to a vocal or warmth to a drum track. Let's A/B this so you can hear what it's doing. For me, the Slate Revival is one of the rules that I rarely break. This plugin usually finds its way onto just about every snare drum and vocal that I record. On toms, things start to get a bit more complicated. After the expander, you're probably noticing another appearance by the depleter we mentioned earlier, but again, it's not activated, and I'll explain why. The depleter is made by Wilkinson Audio, and I picked it up about a year ago after it had been recommended to me as a solution to cymbal bleed in my tom mics. It's about a $40 plugin, and I've had a lot of success with it. The way my and many drum kits are set up, the rack tom mic picks up a lot of bleed from the hi-hats and the left side crash cymbal. I had experimented with noise gates, but was never able to get a natural sounding result. For example, if I was hitting a crash cymbal right after a rack tom, no matter how I set the gate, it would either close too quickly and choke off the decay of the tom, or close too slowly so that you would hear the initial hit and the attack of the crash cymbal in the tom mic, and then all of the sudden it would drop out when the gate closed. And it was very apparent in the mix and just not natural sounding at all. The depleter is essentially a frequency-specific noise gate, so it will open to allow the fundamental frequencies that you determine, in this case of the rack tom, through, but attenuate filtered frequencies like cymbals. I use this plugin quite a bit, and in fact, I'm using it on the floor tom in this track. I had initially put it on the rack tom thinking I would need it, but decided it would be more effective to just trim away everything in between the tom hits from that waveform. Because in this particular song, during the verses, when the rack tom is being played, the hi-hat and the cymbal hits are pretty infrequent, enough so that they've completely decayed by the time the rack tom hit comes around. So if I trimmed away the space in between hits, I didn't have to worry about a cymbal tail suddenly getting louder when the rack tom waveform reappeared. So I decided to take that approach again on this song. Most of the time, I usually end up layering multiple compressors like I did on the kick and the snare. But again, this is another example of hearing what I had with one compressor and liking it. Also, while the sound of the drum itself can certainly benefit when compressed correctly, the more you compress the toms, the more pronounced the cymbal bleed tends to be. And of course, the harder you have to work to sort of control it. So I'll try to get where I want to be on the toms with as little compression as possible, though more often than not, that ends up meaning multiple compressors, and then the depleter comes into play to take care of the cymbals. Again, sweeping the EQ spectrum, looking for areas to cut and boost, and the rack tom was sounding a little dull, so I put Revival on this as well. Last on this track is a great platform from Kilohertz, which you might be familiar with. You've seen a few of their plugins on some of the earlier tracks in this arrangement. I'm using their compressor, their transient shaper on some other drum parts. Their multipass platform is a plugin that hosts multiple of what they call their snap-in VSTs, but allows you to apply the plugin to a specific frequency range rather than over the entire track. In this case, I was losing some of the sustain of the drum when I cut off the waveform after each hit. Let's take a listen without it. Initially, I tried compensating for that with a conventional reverb plugin, just applied directly to the track, but just didn't like the result. What I ended up doing is using the KHS reverb snap-in and applying it only to the lower frequency range of the drum. This way I get the effect of simulating the sustain of the actual drum shell itself without having the stick attack sort of be part of that reverb sound. On the floor tom, very similar signal chain to the rack tom. EQ curve is slightly different and obviously a bit more specific to this drum. But again, using the same detective method we discussed earlier to find what I want to cut and boost, and using the kilohertz reverb in multipass on the low frequencies, again, to emphasize the sustain coming from the drum shell. Overheads, I have a lot of compression going into these. My intent here is really just to keep an even level between the cymbals and the rest of the kit. I'm typically not using my overheads as cymbal mics per se, but rather as just more of a distance capture of the entire drum set. But by virtue of being placed overhead, the cymbals often come out more prominent, so I'm basically using the compressor just to soften the cymbals as best I can and sort of get as close to an even level throughout the entire kit as possible. Let's move on to the effect sends of the kit, and we'll see a bit more depth being created in the mix. The drum bus, which all the individual mics are running through, is pretty basic. I've got a very light, mild compressor on the bus just to sort of help smooth out the whole kit and kind of glue the whole thing together, and some minor EQ tweaks that I made after all the individual mics had been treated just to help clean up the sound, add a little clarity, continue to shape it a little more the way I wanted. The drum reverb send is just that. It's a 100% wet reverb signal so that I can EQ the reverb itself separately from the rest of the kit and then blend it to taste back in with the rest of the mix. The snare effect send is where the kit really comes to life. I've got the debleeder plugin here, again trimming some of the other pieces of the kit away from this particular processing, because you'll notice the send from the snare track is post fader. So all of the effects that are on the original snare track are part of the signal that's coming into this effect send. The next plugin in line is the Waves Real ADT, which simulates the Abbey Road Studios tape-based artificial double tracking, or ADT method. Before we go into this further, I will say that the effect I'm going for here is definitely achievable without this plugin, and this is not meant to be sort of an endorsement of this specific plugin or any in particular. So if you're interested in more information on how to achieve this effect without this plugin or with whatever stock plugins you have available in your DAW, please leave a comment or drop us an email and I'd be happy to share some more information. I gave this plugin a try and found it to be helpful in achieving this result quickly, and I picked it up pretty inexpensively, so it's been something that I go to pretty often on my snare effects. Essentially what this is doing is giving us a very quick slap back delay with a little bit of LFO or low frequency oscillation going on. So mixed back in with the original snare track and the rest of the kit, it creates the illusion that you're actually in the room with the snare drum and you're sort of hearing it coming from all around you. It suddenly sounds a little bit more alive. So let's A/B the snare with and without the effects send, and then the whole kit with and without the snare effects. And now with our guitars. And there you have it, our drums are mixed. Keep in mind, again, this was a relatively simple project. It's a short piece with only 2 alternating parts and not a lot of dynamic variation. What I'm doing to the drums in this song is not necessarily exactly what I do to the drums in every song, but it worked in this piece, and because of the simplicity of this piece, I felt that this was a good piece to use as an introduction to drum mixing. Please feel free to leave any questions in the comments below. Send us an email if you'd like to know more. Next up is going to be bass guitar.